Today we're going to talk about how to get some great tones from the Ibanez AS93fm. Show of hands, how many of you clicked on this video just to come on and type, "How do you get great tones with this guitar? You just plug it in." Oh, no. First of all, my exceptional sense of humor deserves better than that. Second of all, we are lasering in today. Yes, you can just plug this guitar in many ways and get a great tone. However, there are some idiosyncrasies about the tones. There's a unique character and fingerprint, so to speak, of the tone that can lend itself to be good for certain things and not as good for other things. And so this is a deep dive. This is focusing really closely on what does this guitar do? What does it sound like? How can you utilize its strengths? Sometimes how can you make up for its weaknesses? So we're going to jump right in here. The Ibanez AS93fm. This is the Expressionist and one of many really good hollow body or semi-hollow body guitars at pretty budget-friendly prices from Ibanez. This is a pretty impressive guitar for its price point. Now this has the Super 58 pickups. What really struck me when I first plugged this guitar in was this sort of acoustic clarity on the top end, which is something that I wasn't expecting. Usually mid-level hollow bodies, you're fighting the mud pretty much the whole time. You're kind of going for a little bit more brightness and a little bit more articulation and definition to your notes. This one has a ton of top-end articulation to the point where it almost sounds acoustic. I've only ever heard this tone on one other type of guitar before, which is PRS. And the way that I would kind of describe it is, imagine you were to have a piezo built into your guitar with a blend knob, right? So you're not just on the piezo, you can kind of blend it in to the other pickups. Imagine you have a piezo and you just start blending it in with the other pickups, just to the point where you can barely hear it. That's almost what this guitar sounds like. Now, that can be really great because it can give you, again, some really great definition, some really crystal clear note articulation that other hollow bodies don't give you. However, sometimes it also can get in the way of some kind of classic smoother tones that you might want to be going for. Now, before we go any further, I do want to talk about when you talk about how to get a great tone with a certain guitar, there are two things you talk about: the controls on the guitar and also the gear that you pair it with. You know, how you dial in your gear and what gear you use is really as important as how you dial in your guitar. So today I am plugging into a fairly modest and again budget-friendly rig. I'm plugging into a Supro Delta King 12 that's totally stock, and I am using a couple of pretty accessible pedals that aren't crazy over expensive. And I'm also going to share with you some other options for things that you can use rather than this gear if you're just kind of looking for the sound but you need something a little bit different, including things to look for in your modelers for those of you who use modelers. So the first thing I would say is with the guitar is to be aware of how the volume and the tone knobs function and take advantage of it, right? I never used my volume or tone knobs much when I started playing, particularly the tone knob. I thought, why would I want to make my guitar sound duller? Until one day I was playing a Stratocaster into an AC30 at a live gig, and the tone that I had dialed in my bedroom, which sounded amazing, was so bright it was practically cutting people's heads off when I played live. So all of a sudden I realized why your tone knob is there, and I played with the tone rolled off to about 3 for the entire gig and sounded amazing. So keep in mind that some of this is going to depend on the volume that you're playing at and the situation you're in, but also remember that your volume and tone knobs are there for a reason. So for the first tone here, let's dive right back in. We're going to manipulate the tone knob to try and get kind of a warmer but articulate jazz tone that's inspired by Bill Frisell, like an earlier Bill Frisell. I'm thinking something like Have a Little Faith, that kind of tone. If you don't know that, then turn this video off and go listen to Bill Frisell because he's fantastic. What I'm going for is something that's warm but doesn't just sound muffled, and that can be kind of tricky. So if you're going for these tones, it's usually not good to just roll the tone off on whatever pickup you're on. That doesn't always get you the desired result. So what I'm doing is I'm in the middle position, and I've got the tone rolled almost all the way off for the bridge, but I've got the tone all the way up on the neck, and I also turn the volume down slightly on the bridge pickup. And what you'll hear is, again, it's kind of a warm sound, but it still has a nice clarity, it still has definition, but without being edgy. Now on top of that, I'm also using 2 basic effects. I'm using a compressor set very, very low. I'm not using much compression. I'm using it to warm up the signal a little bit, and the way I like to describe it is it kind of glues the notes together a little bit, but without getting overly clicky or squishy or getting any of those kind of compression tones. So for that, I'm using a Pigtronix Philosopher's Tone Gold Mini. And I'm also using a delay. I'm using a Wampler Metaverse delay on tape mode. The tape has kind of a slightly out of tune modulation, and I'm going for that kind of simulated sound of Bill Frisell's kind of infamous, like, sort of vibrato effect that he uses. So between those effects and then using the pickup setting on your guitar, I think you'll hear it's a really nice, very silky, warm, but not muffled kind of jazz tone. You can get this effect with a lot of other compressors. There's certainly lots of delay pedals you can use, and if you're using some kind of a modeler, if you add in a compressor, make sure that you set it low and don't go too overboard with the detuned effect on the delay. Let's check this out. All right, next we're going to go a little more subtle. Again, mention that kind of top-end clarity. Well, what if you want it to sound a little bit more like the classic, the Gibson ES335, right? The 335 really is very much the semi-hollow body that most other semi-hollow bodies are judged by. So what if you want to get a little bit more of that rounded off sweetness of like a 335, but you've got that acoustic sort of top end? Now we're just going to go straight into the amp clean, no other effects or anything. Here's what I found. Notching the volume and the tone just a little bit can make a difference between getting this sort of clear tone and getting more of that 335 tone. So you'll hear when I do this, I'm going to start off with the volume and the tone pretty much rolled all the way up and then back them off a little bit. It's a subtle difference, but it makes a difference. So let's jump back in now, just kind of going straight into the amp totally clean, and hear what you can do with just a little bit of effect on your volume and tone. Now, if you're someone who really likes just this character of the guitar, that's great. It sounds really cool and has a lot of useful applications. The only thing that I found kind of detrimental about it is sometimes it sounded fizzy using drive. So if you're going for a blues tone or, you know, some kind of a classic rock tone with it, there were a couple of times I found it fizzy if I used the wrong kind of drive or effect. So pairing it up with the right amplifier and effect is key. So for this next clip, I'm going to keep the tone and the volume all the way up, kind of the guitar just all out. And I've paired it up with the Wampler Moxie, which is actually one of my favorite new overdrive pedals in general. It's a Tube Screamer inspired pedal, the TS10 inspired pedal. Because here's the tricky thing. You don't want an overly mid-rangey, low-def pedal or drive sound, because it is still a hollow body and it still gets a lot of that kind of warm low end and mid range, and that can get muffled fast. And if you use too much drive, that top end can just kind of disappear and turn into more mud. So you want something that has nice clarity but just kind of cuts off that top end a little bit. So I'm using this Moxie. I think it sounds really good. I think it's good for this application. But basically you want to find a drive that has that nice mix of warmth and a hint of compression, but not too clear on the top end. I wouldn't be one to use like a transparent overdrive with this kind of guitar. It could work. I mean, if you use something and it works great, please let us know in the comments. This is kind of where I'm going with it. But let's check it out. We're going to hear it clean first and then kick on the Moxie. All right, on the subject of the 335, many players like these types of guitars to go for a really big, powerful classic rock or blues rock tone. Something in the realm of early Eric Clapton, like when he played his 335 with Cream. Of course, Joe Bonamassa uses 335s quite a bit, and a lot of other players use 335s for that really big, it's not a stadium, or it's like a modern stadium blues rock tone, which has this really kind of honking mid-range. And the tricky thing with that is that you need to try and simulate power tubes breaking up, and that can be challenging. So what I'm going to do now is, this is kind of crazy. I think it's a cool tone, but it's kind of crazy. I'm going to use a fuzz. I'm using a Mojo Hand Crosstown, and I'm going to tighten that up using a Vic Audio Overdriver, which is kind of a light mid-gain setting. So I'm going to put those two together. Now that's a lot of gain for this guitar, and I was having some feedback when I turned it all the way up. But the key to getting this tone is to dial it in super heavy, but then turn your tone and your volume way back. So I've got the volume at about 4.5, 5, and I've got the tone back at like 2 or 3. So you turn the gain up and then you turn the guitar down, and it gets a really, really cool classic rock, blues rock stadium tone. Now, if you really want to deep dive and sculpt your tone, one of the best things you can possibly get into is using some type of EQ, whether it's an EQ pedal or whether you have an EQ in whatever modeler you have, or if you have an amplifier that has a built-in EQ, something more than just your typical 3-band bass, treble, mids. So what I'm going to do here is add EQ after the fact. So I've recorded this clip, and you're going to hear it raw first, and then going to apply the EQ, and I'll show you a picture on the screen of how I dialed the EQ in. With this guitar, the key I found generally, if you have a good EQ that gives you a lot of control of different frequencies, the frequencies that you tend to want to cut a little bit, you tend to want to cut the top end really to taste. Anything down to about, all the way down to about 4,000 hertz, maybe more like 8,000 hertz depending on how bright and clear you want it to be, but basically just kind of roll off that top end until you get it to a point where you really like it. Now the other place where you want to cut some EQ is down around somewhere between 100 hertz and 500 hertz, usually around 200 or 250. That's where hollow bodies tend to get the muddiness that sort of overpowers your signal. And if you pull some of the frequencies there, you can really clean up your sound, and you get kind of the richness of the other frequencies from your guitar. So you will hear in this next clip how much of a dramatic difference this can be. And again, this would be kind of like if you're using a modeler and adding an EQ down in your signal chain. Again, you can use an EQ pedal. There's all kinds of different ways you can do this. But keep in mind that an EQ pedal or an EQ setting on whatever it is that you're using, that can make a dramatic difference in the way that your tone is coming across. So let's take a listen. All right, folks, that's what I got for the Ibanez AS93fm. Please let us know in the comments. Do you have this guitar? Do you have another guitar from Ibanez's lineup? What do you think of the tone? I'm Jack Fossett. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Follow me on Jack Fossett Official for some music. We'll see you next time.